All right, welcome to the Spotlight Podcast. Now, if you're watching this episode, we have some really cool data for you. That's actually an update to a previous presentation that you may have seen if you were at our Illuminate presentations in New York City and London this year. So, Blake, a trend is afoot. We noticed something earlier this year, didn't we? And it was that short-term rentals are now showing up in a major OTA search pretty often. Can you give us a little bit of background on the trend that you found, what this OTA is, and then just some general background on why hoteliers should be paying attention to this?
There is a trend that we have observed, and it's a very interesting one because when we did this presentation earlier in the year, the trend was different, and it was a fairly long-standing trend. And the trend really fundamentally reversed itself over the past, bunch of months since we presented this data, and it's fascinating. So if you are watching this, great, you'll see it on your screen. If you're not, if you're listening to this on your podcasting platform, I can just explain to you what you see.
Cool. So we've now pulled up a visual. Blake, what is this major OTA? What is this channel that we're looking at today?
Sure. Yeah, this is data direct from Booking.com.
Okay, cool. And what we did, right, was we got onto Booking.com and we did a bunch of searches in each of these major regions. And what we're looking at is the percentage of those top 20. How many of those listings are short-term rentals? Now, at the beginning of the year, we noticed this because it was really taking off, right? Can you kind of walk through, and especially Europe, I think is extra important just because the short-term rental supply there is so huge. Can you walk through kind of what's been going on the past couple of years with this phenomenon, and just a very, very brief bullet point, maybe for each region, just what is the latest?
Totally. Yep. Absolutely. And just to clarify, just when you say, we did a bunch of searches, just for our listeners, this was done truly at scale. This was not just 5 searches and us determining percentages. This was done over a long period of time with scale of a mass scale to truly pin this data down. And yes, exactly like you said. So starting in January 2023 is when the data set, as you see on your screen, starts. And for each region up until early 2025, we see broadly the percentage of search results in the top 20. So the top 20 search results, that percentage of results that are actually short-term rentals as opposed to hotels is increasing gradually, okay? And in Europe, in some cases, it was actually increasing more than gradually. But over time, the general trend is up and to the right. But since early 2025, Q1, we started to see this trend kind of declining on the decrease. And now, as of now, we're sitting here in the fall of 2025, the numbers have come down quite a bit versus where they were late last year, which is quite fascinating because, like I said, the trend fundamentally reversed from where it was at when we did this presentation earlier in the year at the Illuminate conference. And it almost looks, to an extent, like the numbers have settled back to where they had been in January of 2023. But to be clear, we're not saying it's not an issue that hoteliers need to be concerned about or at least be cognizant of and address, because it's definitely still a thing. Like in Europe, we can see the number is still above 20%. So it's not nothing. But the number at the end of, in fourth quarter of last year was north of 30%. So again, still a thing, but perhaps leveling off a bit.
Let's maybe quickly touch on Europe and why Europe is way out there in front of all other regions. I'm just going to throw something at you, Blake, and you tell me if I am even remotely close. Okay. But my perception, just based on looking at our data set, is that the European supply of short-term rentals is like head and shoulders above any other region. Is that why there's so many short-term rentals showing up even in a hotel search on Booking.com for that region? Is it just supply-based, or do you think there's something else going on there?
I definitely think supply probably has something to do with it, but I do think fundamentally that short-term rentals for Europeans culturally, I think Europeans, when they're traveling, default to short-term rentals way more frequently. I still do think that hotels are the dominant accommodation class. But if we're looking purely at the number of Europeans who will say, I'm traveling, short-term rental automatically, versus the Americans or Asians or Africans, Oceanians, Latin Americans, I think Europeans are far and away the first the highest in that kind of characteristic.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's take a look at this next slide too, because I think there's a lot of cool stuff going on here. And we'll be quick through these because we looked at so many markets, like Blake said earlier. But let's take a look at some of our top, this is August of 2025, Booking.com short-term rental unit percentages for those top 20 search results. These are US markets that have at least 250 properties. There's some cool markets on there. And I would say also pretty seasonal markets as well, but I see a lot of the American South on there. Is that a kind of a trend, Blake?
Definitely. Yep. So just like Daniel said, these are big markets. These are ones that have at least 250 properties on Booking.com. And this data, like Daniel said, is in August. And those are key characteristics because as we kind of talk more about this, you'll see just how size of market impacts this statistic, as well as time of year and seasonality. But yes, like you said, you look at all these markets, a lot of Florida. 3 of the top 5 are Florida. We have Kissimmee, we have Destin and Panama City Beach. And then if you add in Nashville and Atlanta and Myrtle Beach and New Orleans, we have 7 of the top 10 markets in the Southeast. And then if you take it a step further and you add Los Angeles and Big Bear Lake in, you have 9 of the top 10 are in the southern half of the U.S., with Seattle being the only city in this list that's in the northern half of the country.
But what happens though if we look at another month that isn't the dead of summer? Does anything change if we look at, say, the spring?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is yes. So again, we kept 250 constant. The variable here is April 2025. So we just moved to a different season. So a few things. Just first and foremost, you'll notice here the top 4 are all 7.4% and above, which is higher than the number 2 in August. You can see number 2 here in August was 7.1. Here, the top 4 are all above that. You also have in the previous slide, numbers 9 and 10 were below 1%. Here, nothing is below 1%. You have Miami and Miami Beach and Orlando. Those weren't even in the top 10. Branson, Missouri, which is number 1, that wasn't even in the top 10 in August. That's crazy, right? I mean, it just shows how much seasonality is a factor when it comes to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And then not only seasonality too, but if you think about the supply in a given market, what happens when you drop the threshold a little bit? So you're no longer looking at like the big markets when you start to look at smaller markets.
This is where things get crazy, dude, because now we're back in August, right? Back in August. But now we are looking at property minimums of 100 properties listed on Booking.com. And just so everyone knows, a property is defined as either a hotel or a short-term rental unit, a bookable short-term rental unit. But I mean, look at this. Look at the size of the numbers. 80.7, 53.8, 44.5. We see that these smaller markets just have such an astronomical amount of short-term rentals appearing in those Booking.com search results. And here, I mean, to an extent, I do think that this is definitely impacted by the fact that there are fewer hotels in these markets. So Booking.com naturally are going to show something that people might book in this situation, short-term rentals. But I just overall just think that when you have smaller markets like this, and you just see that it's largely short-term rentals that are appearing, in some cases more than half.
Yeah, a lot of these strike me as markets that have really big influxes of demand at key parts of the year that the hotel supply probably isn't able to capture all of that demand. And so there are these strategic times throughout the year where I would assume short-term rentals really kind of jump on that. Because Keystone, Joshua Tree, those don't strike me as places that have like a million hotels.
Totally. And I think one of the key takeaways from this and later data, as you'll see, when you're comparing markets in hospitality, 2 markets may seem very similar, but have strikingly different characteristics or features once you kind of dive under the hood. So something may seem similar, but one market might have 3 times the short-term rentals appearing on Booking.com top 20 search results. The impact that short-term rentals have on that market might be very different, despite the fact that on the surface, the markets might seem very similar.
So Blake, can you show me a little bit of, let's talk about that European region, just because the supply of short-term rentals is so strong there. What's going on with some of these top European markets?
Yep, so these are minimum 900 properties. So again, these are the big ones, but big by European standards and is different than big by American standards in terms of short-term rental market sizing. And you look at these again, obviously high numbers, high percentage numbers. But the big thing that jumps out at me is that Portugal is the only Western European country represented on this list. All other countries are Eastern European and in the Balkans. So, as we start to paint a picture of nations or areas or parts of the world that are more affected by this phenomenon of short-term rentals in those Booking.com search results, we see that this is perhaps more of an issue on the eastern side of Europe.
And then if we look at a different month, if we change that analysis from August and then move to December, what do you see there?
Yeah. So, I mean, look at how these percentages are so much lower. Again, 900 minimum properties. So we kept that constant, and now we just wanted to shift back to a completely different season, winter. 8.5% is the highest. So aside from the fact that these numbers are just so much lower, and beyond that, I mean, look at the nations that are represented on the list. The list is entirely comprised of Western European countries. 5 of them are in Italy, and everything else, it's just completely Western European countries. And that, honestly, this just stresses how important data is. Because if you don't know this and you don't realize how different it is season to season and market size wise, you're going to be kind of flying blind as a hotelier.
All right, Blake. So let's take a look at this last region that you're kind of putting the microscope on. We're going to look at big markets in APAC, and then we're going to look at smaller markets in APAC, but both for August of 2025.
Totally. So what we see here, this is minimum 900 properties. So these are going to be your bigger markets, and August 2025. And the big takeaway I see here is Malaysia. 4 of the top 5 are in Malaysia. Number 1 is Bari in Vietnam, but beyond that, the 4 next ones are all in Malaysia. So I think Malaysia and Vietnam are the 2 markets that are really, truly impacted by this. And what's also kind of crazy is that if we go to the next one, so now this is minimum of 200 properties. So now we're talking smaller markets, and every single one, everyone except for number 4, 9 out of the top 10 are all Malaysia. So clearly, this is a phenomenon that is impacting Malaysia and also Vietnam, but Malaysia clearly far and away number 1.
So let's do a couple of quick takeaways from this data, because people who are listening or watching may not have seen their market on some of those lists. Totally. Some takeaways that I would glean from this, Blake, and tell me if I'm on target or if I'm way off the mark. But I think this just kind of reinforces the fact that you need to have your eye on the data, because it may be a month right now where you're not really all that threatened by short-term rentals. But in 4 months or 5 months, when you get to your peak season, you may be in a month where it's really competitive and you're competing with a ton of short-term rentals. There may be 30% short-term rentals showing up in a Booking.com search.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, some of these are a bit more high level and some are a bit more granular. But I mean, broadly speaking, Europe being more affected, North America and Asia are least affected, but nonetheless, it's an issue across the board. We do know that the phenomenon is kind of correcting itself a little bit, but it's still very much a thing. There's a lot of seasonal variance, as well as variance between smaller markets and larger markets, with higher percentages generally appearing in those smaller markets. We're seeing that difference between northern and southern U.S. Eastern versus Western Europe. We saw that was impacted in some instances by seasonality. We saw in December it was much more weighted for Western Europe, and then in the August it was Eastern Europe, and then obviously as it relates to Asia Pacific, Malaysia seems to be the country that is most affected by this.
Cool. Well, let's segue to this next section, because I think this is the first time that we're kind of showing the world this new metric that you created. So this is why you, sir, are the director of hospitality research, because you see an interesting trend and you say, that should have its own proprietary metric. So can you explain
metrics,
a little bit?
Maybe that's what we do.
Can you explain what the listing multiple is?
Absolutely. And to be honest, I find the best metrics are the simplest ones, and this one's so simple, but it really has an impact if you think about it. It's called listing multiple, and it literally is just the average number of sites that any short-term rental is listed on. So, some short-term rental owners will list on Booking and Airbnb and, whatever, multiple sites, versus some owners might just want to list on one. So the listing multiple literally is just the multiple. It's the number of, on average, of how many distribution sites or platforms each individual short-term rental is listed on. It's literally the number of listings in a market divided by the number of properties in the market, and then you get listing multiple. It's That easy.
So what are the implications of, say, if you saw a market that had a really high listing multiple, like 2.8 or 3 or something like that, and then you saw a market that had a really low listing multiple of like a 1.1? Does that mean that short-term rentals have way more sophisticated distribution? Does that mean that a market is super, super competitive for short-term rentals and they're all struggling to survive?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a couple of points to make here. One, so I think when a market has a higher listing multiple, it means that short-term rentals are going to have broader, more diverse exposure for the owner and for for the short-term rental unit to capture bookings. So if you're a hotelier, you have to be aware of the degree of competition or how competitive your short-term rentals are going to be, and the breadth of their distribution definitely is going to impact that. As we'll see shortly, there are definitely characteristics we have spotted that markets that have higher listing multiples tend to feature. These are features or characteristics of the markets that will kind of explain why a short-term rental market might have a higher listing multiple.
Yeah, show me some of these markets because I am curious.
Sure.
I have some ideas about what a high listing multiple market might be, but let's see if that holds up when we actually calculate the listing multiple.
Totally. So right here we have the top 10 markets by supply as of August 2025 in the US, and I'm going to pop the listing multiples under each one. Los Angeles, lowest one on the list, okay, 1.2. Opposite end of the spectrum, we have Destin at 2, okay? So that for at least for the top 10 biggest markets, that is what the range of listing multiple is for August. Look at the other ones that are generally very high. The 4 highest of this list are Destin, Orlando, Myrtle Beach, and Panama City Beach. And what do you think when you think of those markets? Those are leisure-heavy markets. These are markets that are perhaps more seasonal. These are markets that are going to have a lot of resorts and just, why might the listing multiples be higher in a resort leisure heavy market? Think about who are the short-term rental owners competing with in these markets. Resorts, right? That have amenities and pools and golf and spas and tennis and hot tubs, ping pong. And I love ping pong, Daniel. And if you're competing with ping pong, you need to do things to stand out, okay? So these are the markets where you're compelled to list in multiple places because you're competing against resorts. Beyond that, I think that when you have a seasonal market, like markets that are going to thrive in much shorter time stretches throughout the year, you have to make a lot of your money as a short-term rental owner, or a hotel for that matter, in a much narrower window in a seasonal market relative to a market like Los Angeles, which is perennial, right? It's demand all year round. So when you have a short window to make, or just a abbreviated, I don't even have to say short, but just a truncated window to make your money, you're probably going to want to list a lot, right? So that's the other reason why I think that that's a thing.
Okay, so it's not just because you're in a major population center. That does not immediately mean that this listing multiple is going to be really, really high. It's actually more of these seasonal markets that seem to have the highest listing multiple.
Totally.
Now, does this hold up in Europe if we were to contrast this with some of those major European markets?
Totally. It does actually. I mean, look, so here they are. Here are the listing multiples. The smallest on this list is Paris. That's your year-round perennial market. And then the highest is Istria. Okay. So again, we're talking, leisure, obviously more seasonal, a lot of, on that more resorty scene. I mean, look at the top 3, Marbella, Crete, Istria. These are outdoor, seasonal, leisure, beachy markets, right? Yeah. I mean, that's just kind of, so yes, to answer your question, very much holds up.
Nice. So one thing that is also in the back of my mind is just, I'm hearing some of these city names, Blake, especially when I see like Rome, I kind of start to think about regulations and whether or not regulations have anything to do with actually any of the trends that we've talked about. So how often that the short-term rentals are showing up in an OTA search, how apt they are to list on multiple OTAs or multiple channels. Let's maybe talk a little bit about regulation because I think it is somewhat of a hot button issue.
100%. It is such a hot button topic right now in the industry. You open up any hospitality industry, periodicals, there's something about regulation and a new market saying that they're going to be getting rid of short-term rentals, Barcelona getting rid of them, and other markets are just putting on more rigid restrictions. On your screen, I want to kind of walk you through really quickly an example from New York. And this one is a little bit, slightly older. I mean, not that old. It's a few years old. But I like it because it really just shows how impactful and how quickly the regulations can impact the hospitality industry. So New York City, for a while, they had maintained that there had been regulations already in place saying that you couldn't rent a short-term rental for less than 30 days unless the host is there. With you couldn't have more than 2 guests. Guests must have unobstructed access to the whole home. They claimed that there were regulations, but the problem was that they weren't being enforced. And it was having an impact of driving up rents and housing shortages. And, the rent is too damn high.
The rent is too damn high. Thank you so much.
Right? That was what that was what it was. So everything changed in September of 2023. They decided now is time to actually enforce these rules, right? So hosts have to register their properties to rent on a short-term basis, and there will be fines for hosts and for platforms for violating the regulations that were being put in place, that were in place. So let's see how this actually manifested itself in the data. So what we have here is a trailing 12-month 2 charts. One is trailing 12-month supply for short-term rentals, and one is trailing 12-month hotel pricing. It's probably obvious, though, that the chart starts January 2020, and we can see everything tanking with COVID. And we can see that both short-term rental supply and hotel pricing both dropping precipitously. Then we see hotel pricing recovering first, and we all know this kind of YOLO mentality that people had as they were coming out of COVID. So hotel pricing goes through the roof and surpasses where it was before COVID, right? Now it's well beyond where it was. And then it started to level off because honestly, the hotel prices were too damn high, to put it, to do a throwback.
Thank you so much.
So the hotel prices got so high that they kind of peaked out, and then they started kind of petering a little bit. Actually, they were coming down slightly. But then everything changes in September of 2023. That is when the regulations go into place. Now, you could see that short-term rental supply hadn't fully recovered yet from COVID. Hotel pricing had more than recovered, right? But short-term rental supply had not. It was on the uptrend. But then short-term rental regulations go into enforcement in September 2023, and we immediately see short-term rental supply just level out. And it just kind of stopped that uptrend, and it goes to that level trend, and then you see hotel pricing just resume growth. Fascinating little anecdote, but it just shows how much this comes through in the data.
Yeah, and if you're listening, the big takeaway here is that after those regulations started to be enforced, the short-term rental supply never recovered to its pre-COVID levels. And then you really see the hotel pricing growth take off, and the short-term rental supply is just completely flatlining.
Yep.
I mean, there may be a tiny bit of growth in there, but it's
marginal,
really
yeah.
Flatlining. Yeah. Cool. So let's put it all together, Blake. So you came up with something called the Short-Term Rental Market Impact Index, and it's looking at a ton of different factors, many of which we've already talked about so far in this episode. Can you briefly walk through what some of the considerations are that go into this index? And then let's have some fun and look at some of these cities that are most impacted by short-term rentals and then the least impacted by short-term rentals.
Right now, this impact index, we created it because honestly, like I said before, 2 markets might look very similar and have very different impact in terms of how short-term rentals are impacting their market. And the same way that some markets might appear very different, but actually have very similar impact from short-term rentals. So if you look at this, right now, this is kind of our V1 of our index. Right now, it factors in price growth for hotels as opposed to price growth for short-term rentals, the number of short-term rentals that are appearing in those Booking.com top 20 search results, as well as hotel versus short-term rental supply.
Cool. So let's check out some of these cities here, because I think there's a lot of interesting markets. And if you're listening or watching, who knows, your market may be on here.
It might be. So let's go European first, shall we? So this is the spectrum of the least impacted lighthouse destination of Maceió, Brazil, to the most impacted lighthouse destination, which is Dubrovnik, okay? So here we have it. Again, the markets may seem similar on the surface, but anything but similar in terms of STR impact. I mean, just look at Prague and London, okay? These are very different cities, but they have nearly identical impact in terms of short-term rentals impact on the market. Prague and London, very different.
Yeah, and again, we're seeing some of those names that we saw earlier and some of the countries that we saw earlier. So I'm noticing some of the most impacted seem to be a little bit more either Mediterranean or Eastern European or kind of more beachy leisure destinations.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I see Santorini up there. Santorini's near the top. Obviously, Istria, we talked about that.
And what about some of our key U.S. cities?
So for this one, for the U.S., I just wanted to show the U.S. cities. So rather than doing the whole spectrum of lighthouse destinations, this is just the U.S. destinations. And this is the spectrum of Reno, Nevada, being the least impacted U.S. destination, to Gulf Shores, Alabama, the most impacted U.S. destination.
Yeah, and I'm noticing, again, spring breaky kind of destinations, I think, are showing up here a lot too. And another interesting one I see is Park City, Utah.
Yeah.
Now, I think Park City, Utah might be up there. This is pure speculation, but a lot of this data obviously is looking at before the Sundance Film Festival moved to Boulder. I would imagine that represents Park City's really huge recurring seasonal event. And I'm thinking that there's probably a huge influx of short-term rentals, or there were, back whenever that Sundance Film Festival would happen.
It's a good call out. Absolutely.
And let's wrap up the list here by taking a look at some of our APAC destinations and how they're impacted.
Yep. So here we are. And much like the U.S., I just limited this list to Asian APAC cities. And this one is crazy because look, Kuala Lumpur is so far ahead of everything. It makes the scale a little bit challenging to actually discern. So I'm actually going to go ahead and take Kuala Lumpur out. So this is the spectrum from Sendai to Vientiane because we took Kuala Lumpur out.
Cool. Yeah, a lot of Japan on here.
You mean we see Sendai, we see Fukuoka, Okinawa, Osaka, and Tokyo all towards the upper end of that spectrum, which again is technically in the middle of the spectrum, just knowing how far ahead Kuala Lumpur is.
All right. Awesome presentation, Blake. So let's round up with kind of like our maybe top 3 big takeaways from this episode. So we noticed this trend last year, right? Where on a booking.com search, more and more short-term rentals were showing up in that top 20 search results. But it was increasing. It kind of reached a high point last year, and now it's been tapering off, correct?
Absolutely, yep. And the data is very seasonal, and the data is very dependent on market sizing in terms of which markets are more impacted than the others.
Yep, and we also came up with this listing multiple as well, which is kind of a litmus test for hoteliers to see how many channels short-term rentals are listing on in their market.
And we definitely saw that markets that are perennial versus seasonal markets are impacted differently in that regard.
We also talked about the impact of regulation on certain markets, New York City being kind of the top example that was most illustrative of those trends.
Yep, and we saw literally once the enforcement went into place, we saw short-term rental growth kind of leveled off and hotel pricing growth just took off.
And then finally, we looked at the short-term rental market impact index that you created that looks at all of these different variables and rolls them up into one kind of nice metric so you can see if you're in a market that is really highly impacted by these short-term rentals or not so much impacted by short-term rentals. This has been the Spotlight Podcast. Thanks for watching. I'm Daniel Foreman.
My name is Blake Ryder.
We'll see you next time.